Here's an opinion I read. It's a nuclear risk opinion about why do so many Pentagon projects go so far over budget. And it's by Wendy Jordan. She goes on to say the Jetsons explain. And so let's review it. I have to manipulate the technology here to capture the story. All right. Let's say you're remodeling the kitchen and you hire a general contractor to manage the product that saves you the bother of finding all the tradespeople. After all, you don't want to manage every detail. But do you also let your contractor choose the refrigerator, oven, and microwave for you without worrying about the specific needs or the best price? Now imagine the general contractor is the head of a federal agency in the United States government working for the taxpayers to manage the people and run the show. And just as you wouldn't let the general contractor pick an appliance without considering the cost and the variety of brands, you don't want the agency head handing out procurement contracts without competition. Taxpayer money is being used to buy those goods. Every American should be concerned whether their dollars are being well spent, and they deserve to pay only the best price on the project that meets their government's needs. So how does the process work, and why do so many Pentagon contracts go over budget? And why are so many defense contractors, including the huge contract for providing a new generation of intercontinental ballistic missiles, given a sole source basis without competitive bidding? To keep this understated, understandable, and out of the way from real-world classified examples, we're going to borrow from a classic yet futuristic 1960s cartoon, The Jetsons. Sprockets for the Space Force. The show is set in 2062. George Jetson is the main character, is a salesman for Spacely Sprockets. The company motto is catchy, the sprocket that's easy on your pocket. From this, we can infer that the corporation is attempting to drive business to its product by offering it at a reasonable price within the budgets of many customers. Now let's fast forward or backward to the year 2020 and imagine George is looking at a potential new government customer for Sprockets, the United States Space Force. The Space Force could be a huge customer for Spacely Space Sprockets, and George Jetson is determined to capture that market for his company. George hasn't sold to the federal government before, but he knows that a hallmark of government contracting is competition. The first stop on his quest to educate himself is the Competition in Contracting Act, which dates back to the early 1980s and was enacted to increase both the number of qualified competitors and the amount of savings the government and taxpayers could expect to realize. The goal of the act is summed up in this: the contracting officer must promote competition to maximum extent practicable. However, exceptions are sometimes necessary in the complex world of buying goods for the federal government. This is especially true in the highly specialized market related to weapon systems. Sprockets are a system component, and George is likely pitching a business-to-business solution to one or more prime contractors to supply sprockets for the next big Space Force procurement program. But George, looking for every opportunity to write purchase orders, is also keen to sell his product directly to Space Force for its spare parts inventory. To do that under the Competition and Contracting Act, Spacely Space Sprockets must compete against its peers in the sprocket business, as well as prime contractors that may pressure their subcontractors to drive down costs to make cheap spare sprockets part of the prime contract. From the position of the Space Force in this fictional scenario, how does the contracting officer who works for the government make sure he or she is getting the best deal during negotiations with George Jetson? George would like to have Spacely Space Sprockets be the sole provider of sprockets to the Space Force spare parts inventory, and is worried that in normal competition, his rival Cogswell Cosmic Cogs may underbid him and end his chance to corner this market. But the Space Force wants the best product at the most reasonable cost, and contracting officer is legally obliged to maximize the competition. But there's an exception. Sole source procurements are allowed if the head of the agency has made written declaration. That decision has cited a specific statutory or regulatory authority to limit competition, exceptions, and exceptions to exceptions. So if contracting officer wants to cut off competition and give Spacely Space Sprockets sole source contract, that would have the Space Force cite a credible reason to limit competition. I have to manipulate my screen again. The regulators and the regulations are laid out in Federal Acquisition Regulation Subpart 6.302 titled Circumstances Permitting Other Than Full and Open Competition. Exceptions can be made and competition restricted when there's only one reasonable source. There is unusual or compelling urgency. There is a need to establish or maintain industrial mobilization, engineering, development, or research capability, or expert services. There is a prevailing international agreement. There is a national security reason, or full and open competition is not in the public interest. There are also exceptions to the exceptions, this being the Byzantine world of government contracts effective March 17th, 2020. The contracts awarded under the 8A Small Business Set-Aside Program, contracting officers may now ignore the written justification or sole source contracts worth less than $100 million, a substantial increase over the previous $22 million threshold. So George Jetson is hoping to corner the market, will try to convince the contracting officer and the head of the agency that giving them a sole source contract fits into one of these exceptions. Well, you can drive a truck through those exceptions. If George Jetson is successful and the Space Force gives him a sole source contract for sprockets, what protections exist for the public interest in the taxpayers' wallets? In the 1960s, Congress passed the so-called Truth in Negotiations Act, subsequently amended in the last 50 years and now renamed as the Truthful Cost or Pricing Data Statute. As the new name lays out, the law requires contractors to submit costs or pricing data to the government. The fiscal year 2018, the National Defense Authorization Act increased the threshold for submitting that additional information from contracts worth $750,000 to those worth $2 million or more. Wow. Let's keep going. Cost or pricing data is defined as any and all facts that be prudent to the buyer would believe could significantly affect price negotiations. This data may include vendor quotes, non-recurring costs, and trends in unit costs, and must be certified by the bidder as accurate, current, and complete. The government, in turn, uses this information from the bidder to determine price reasonableness. One wrinkle that may benefit Spacely Space Sprockets is that theirs is a commercial product. There's no requirement for cost and pricing data on commercial products because it's assumed the market has established the fair and reasonable price. Yeah, right. Like a toilet seat lid is $300 in the market, but yet, our Air Force has paid $10,000 for a toilet seat cover. But we'll continue. Back to the real world. How the government defines commercial products has recently been relaxed to a ludicrous point. Virtually anything sold to the government that is of a type of something sold commercially can now be exempted from disclosure of cost and pricing data. Is your company bidding on a fighter jet contract with the military? Well, there is a commercial market for aircraft, so your company can press for an exception by submitting cost and pricing data. It really is almost as simple and as insidious as that. Also, the pressures of real-world mergers and acquisitions have dramatically telescoped the number of defense contractors in the last 25 years. The sad truth is there are fewer and fewer corporations that could be considered both responsible and responsible to the requirements of the highly complex contracts pursued in the defense sector. The government can end up with circumstances where there is only one responsive bidder. So I'm going to stop there for just a moment. Why are we approving these mergers and acquisitions? We've had rules, we've had laws for over 100 years, antitrust laws, and every administration seems to be ignoring these laws and in a disservice to the public interest. But let's continue with this article. It's fascinating and fun with the Jetsons analogy. The 85 billion sole source missile, a recent example of contracting gone awry, is the ground-based strategic deterrent, a program to build the weapon that will eventually replace all of the United States intercontinental ballistic missiles. Jeez Louise. You know, these intercontinental ballistic missiles that are land-based, you know, this nuclear triad where you have land, sea, and air, nuclear capabilities. It's so over-redundant. Why do we do this? Why are we wasting this? But let's continue. A Pentagon cost estimate states that the price tag will run to at least $85 billion. In the summer of 2019, Boeing dropped out of the competition and left Northrop Grumman as the only bidder. When there's only one bidder, it's hard to be sure the taxpayer is getting the best price or design. And by the way, Northrop Grumman is one of the big contributors to Betty McCollum, the incumbent congresswoman in Minnesota's 4th Congressional District, and I'm challenging her to represent our district. She is the Sub-Appropriations Committee for Defense, and it is a conflict of interest for her to be taking money from the industry she's supposed to be regulating. Let's continue with the story. Under most circumstances in recent history, taxpayers could be confident that the head of a federal agency would make any sole source decision in their best interest. In a normal scenario, the agency head would take advice from the contracting officer, government contract lawyers, acquisition officials, and other experts. After all, that official's signature would remain a part of the public record of the procurement. But in this moment in history, can any of us have that confidence in the procurement system? Stop to think how many United States agencies are run by someone in an acting capacity. What safeguards are there that people who have not gone through a normal vetting process and who may be trying to curry favor in order to get the job permanently will withstand external pressures when it comes to spending American taxpayers' dollars? Unfortunately, the recent trend towards this is less transparency, less competition in the government contracting. Congress must exert its constitutionally mandated oversight role to ensure that as federal spending increases at an unprecedented pace, sole source contracts, whether the $5 sprockets or the billion-dollar missiles, are properly justified. As the coronavirus crisis shows, we need science now more than ever. The Bulletin elevates expert voices above the nonsense, but as an independent nonprofit media organization, our operations depend. So I'll have to edit that out.